Hey guys, welcome to the Liberal Hive Mind, a channel solely focused on exposing the abundant hypocrisy of the left. Big government Democrats have failed the most vulnerable, they have failed the kids. It's such a point of frustration for me. We got these Democrats, these big union bosses like Randi Weingarten, always pushing these outraged narratives. Donald Trump wants to come after the Department of Education and our spending. The kids, right? The kids.
They're just taking opportunity away from kids that don't have it. So billionaires, kids of billionaires, they have it. They go to private schools. Everyone else go to public schools. Don't take away their opportunity.
Donald Trump's supposedly the bad guy in this story because he wants to reform the whole system and change the way money is spent. In other words, stop this blank federal check nonsense that's clearly not achieving much. But Democrats, of course, always throw a hissy fit whenever you talk about pulling funding or shutting down a department, because in their minds, the more departments, the more bureaucrats, the more administrators, the more taxpayer money you throw at something, always the better result. But each and every single time, that argument just isn't backed up by the facts. Now, the reality is, despite all the increased spending, and despite the increased bureaucracy, and most importantly, the left-wing Democrat control over public education, the reality is that American schools are failing hard. And where the real failure lies is in failing the students. And where the real hypocrisy lies is in the fact that the most vulnerable of kids, those who come from bad neighborhoods, broken homes, and low-income families, well, they're the ones who are being failed the most. They're the ones who are falling further and further behind under the Democrats' watch. So the whole shtick here of Randi Weingarten and these other Democrats talking about the kids and the poor kids, well, it's frickin' bollocks. And the latest report, actually from the New York Times of all places, really puts that into perspective. Let me show you guys exactly what's going on here. We got some stuff to get into, so let's roll the tape. All right, folks, so we've got this article here from the New York Times. It's titled, "The Pandemic is Not the Only Reason U.S. Students Are Losing Ground. For years, the country's lowest scoring students were steadily improving on national tests, and then starting around 2013, something changed. And so I guess things have now gotten bad enough to where even the New York Times is reporting on the truth. They just dropped this brutal article, and for once, they're actually not even trying to spin things. They're straight up admitting that America's poorest students are falling further and further behind. For years back in the 2000s, even kids at the bottom, the lowest performers, were making progress, slow progress. Although the numbers weren't necessarily great in bad neighborhoods, it still wasn't necessarily as peachy as you'd like, but at least the floor was slowly rising. The education system seemed to be making some progress, but now that floor is gone, the bottom is gone, and test scores for the lowest performing students are in absolute freefall. We're talking 4th graders who can't even read, 8th graders who can't do basic math. The whole system is collapsing, and it's been happening especially over the last decade. And you hear the same excuse all the time, which, is a valid excuse. Absolutely, it's part of it. People will always point at the pandemic and use it as a scapegoat. But the reality is, as the New York Times admits, these kids have been falling further and further behind since 2013. And it seems as though it all seems to coincide with when the Democrats took control of education, when they gutted No Child Left Behind, which was passed by George Bush in 2001, essentially when they decided to stop holding schools accountable. Democrats simply capitulating to the teachers' unions, I guess. We got these Democrats talking about the kids, the poor kids, the kids in the low-income brackets, but they have systematically left poor kids behind. We're talking about the most vulnerable students here, kids from low-income families. Instead of stepping up and forcing basic standards on the schools and the teachers, they totally gave up and took a hands-off, laissez-faire approach because, as we know and as they're proving again, accountability in government, accountability for federal employees and local government employees is somehow a bad thing. No, they decided to take a totally different, radical approach, pushing nonsense like testing is racist, standards are racist, and look what they've accomplished. A generation of kids who cannot read or write. And we're supposed to be competing with the students that are coming out of Japan and Singapore? It's pure insanity. There's no more standards anymore. Just affirming people, constantly affirming people. That's been the left-wing approach. You can't teach English because English is racist. Speaking proper English is white supremacy, right? No, we have to listen to the crackpot academics who tell us that AAVE is a perfectly acceptable version of English. And if you have a problem with that, well, you better check yourself because you're probably racist. The standards are completely out the frickin' window. And your typical milquetoast fence sitter might tell you, well, actually, it's not a political thing. It's not Democrat versus Republican. It's not left versus right, but it absolutely is. Just look at California, then look at Florida. You got a school system in California that's implemented everything under the sun that is woke, and they've fallen to the absolute bottom of the barrel. And then you've got Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, who's taken as much control as he possibly can. They've totally taken over the state's education system, booted all the woke stuff out of their schools, from the social Marxist crap, the CRT nonsense, the 1619 Project, DEI, gender theory, I mean, you name it. They've completely revamped the system, and they're now #1 in education, at least in higher education, and #6 in K through 12. The proof is in the frickin' pudding, and actually even the New York Times admitted that Mississippi, of all places, is becoming a model for education. Because guess what? They've actually managed, just like Florida, to reverse the trend by focusing on phonics, on real standards, and teacher accountability. They baked accountability into the system, and it's working. You know, the Democrats gotta take the frickin' L on this one. And to actually even add to that argument, enter the pandemic. Because that was really the final nail in the coffin. That was really the catalyst that exposed the whole thing. And again, it is a Democrat issue. Blue states locked their schools down for years. For 2 frickin' years. And of course, again, who got the short end of the stick? Rich kids went to private schools, schools that held them accountable, or good public schools in high-income zip codes. They were able to adapt relatively well, learning from home. The school was holding people accountable. Attendance was properly taken care of. A lot of these kids are able to get laptops. Their parents are supervising them and making sure that things are going well. But what about the poor kids, the people from broken homes, left with no supervision? They were just given an iPad with no instructions, no accountability, no standards, no attendance. As we saw during the pandemic, so many of these kids were just out on the streets committing crimes, joining gangs, engaging in carjackings, retail theft. I mean, the list goes on. No education, no direction, just chaos. And at the time, Democrats were too focused on grabbing as much power during the pandemic, on implementing policies that benefited the big multinational corporations and Wall Street, and of course too focused on activism and defunding the police and trying to influence the 2020 election. And so kids be damned, right? That's essentially exactly what happened. Democrats talking about the kids. They threw the most vulnerable kids under the frickin' bus. And so in my view, they've lost the right to complain. Talking about Trump closing or reforming the Department of Education. How dare he? He's trying to undo all the work that we've done. What work? You guys are a disaster. With the results that you've achieved here, achieve in quotation marks, of course, you should be fired. All of you.
You're fired!
In the private sector, this would never fly. And so enter the one concept that seems to be kryptonite for any Democrat, any left-wing collectivist thinker. Enter into the room accountability. You guys had your chance to reform education. You undid George Bush's legislative agenda, blew up the spending, blew up the Department of Education, took control of schools, pushed all kinds of social Marxist crap, and now the reality is you have fundamentally failed. You've actually failed in 2 different ways. Firstly, you failed the students, as test scores are now plummeting into the frickin' ground, and secondly, you failed in your little indoctrination play, trying to turn the next generation into little leftist activist minions. Yeah, go figure, now Gen Z is the most right-wing of any generation in modern history, but you've absolutely failed, and so it's time to eat a big slice of humble pie, take a frickin' step back, stop with the entitlement, and let Republicans get a swing at it. Anyways, that's pretty much what I got for you guys on this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and possibly subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.